Good afternoon. Respected Chairperson of the State Bank of India, Dr. Soumyakanti Ghosh, Senior Executives, my friends, ladies and gentlemen. We start about 6 minutes early, but be rest assured I'm not going to use that extra time. So I think I like the title of the theme of this two-day conclave. India's quest for self-reliance in a fragmented world, and I think that's a right pursuit that we need to have. In fact, my presentation will tell you that we need to be more ambitious, we need to move further or graduate further from self-reliance to even strategic indispensability. So strategic invulnerability is equivalent to self-reliance, but without being strategically indispensable, you cannot be strategically invulnerable. So as the world goes through a churn, upheaval, or a resetting of the last 80 years of established order, it throws up, as normally it does, both chaos and opportunities. And we need to be a lot more nimble-footed and also be able to depart from our established ways and means of decision making, both in the private and in the public sector. And the considerations that we normally apply in making those decisions. All those things have to be up for discussion, review, and even jettisoning overboard. So let me just share with you the state of the world as we see. Notwithstanding the fact that the IMF upgraded the growth numbers for the coming year in October as compared to what they told us in April 2025, on a trend basis, we are seeing lower global growth and lower trade growth. And trade restrictions and the emergence of blocs will also eventually affect investment flows. It's a matter of time. And climate change and energy transition are actually in a state of transition. If you go by the remarks made by Mr. Starmer in COP30 yesterday, I think several countries are now beginning to recognize the very trade-offs that we have been flagging in the last 2 or 3 economic surveys. Technology and jobs, which was the theme, and Lata was there in the morning curating a session that I was part of. That's an issue that is still very much open for discussion, and it is still very early days. What you see on the right side is a chart that shows you that trade restrictions are not just a recent Trump 2 phenomena, but they continued well after Trump 1 presidency ended. In fact, they even intensified a lot further between 2020 and 24. And I must also add, this is global, the number of trade restrictions that the world imposes on each other, countries impose on each other. And I must tell you that the European Union has 80% of its trade actions directed at one country, and I don't need to name it. And I think that is the state of affairs with respect to global trade. And it is in this environment that we have to strive to become strategically indispensable, at least in a few areas. It's not an easy challenge. Uncertainty is, it's obvious, it's at unprecedented historical highs. And what it does is to make humans opt for status quo. Risk aversion is a natural fallout of uncertainty being elevated, and it will show up in global investment flows, trade flows, and also capital flows. And what you see on the right side is what I mentioned earlier in the first slide, that on average, trend growth rates will be lower than what we were used to. For example, in the first decade of the millennium, when global growth averaged 4 to 5%. So now it's the other way around. Advanced economies are looking at a growth rate of 1.6% next year, and EMDE is looking at about 4%. And so by and large, I think we need to be prepared for a low growth world, and that makes the challenge of distribution and equity even more complex than they already are. Now, this slide, which I picked up about 5 years ago from the internet, and I don't know this gentleman, I didn't know him then, I don't know him now. But what is interesting is when he put this slide out in 2020 February, it was early days after COVID had broken out on a global basis. And what you see are the 5 pink boxes at the bottom and in the middle. Populism, trade wars, financial repression, military conflicts, negative real yields are the consequences of the process that had opened up post-2008 financial crisis. And he was very prescient with respect to almost all of them, and negative real yields in developed countries is a matter of time. They are coming, and that goes hand in hand with financial repression. But trade wars, military conflicts and populism are very much already on display. But the important point that he is trying to point out here is that the origin doesn't lie in personalities and the policies they followed, whether it is from 2016 or 2024, etc. And it will be wrong to therefore give disproportionate blame or credit or ascribing to individuals here. But the process actually started when we responded to the crisis thrown up by excessive debt, by lowering interest rates to zero and printing money, which basically encouraged further debt accumulation. And the result of that is what you see in the middle portion of this slide, which is monopolistic behavior, higher inequality, and more financial fragility, asset bubbles, etc. But given that we are still not exorcised the ghost of 2008 and more financial stimulus, in fact, in the last few years, notwithstanding the fact that the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, financial conditions in the United States never really tightened. And that is why we see one more bubble now, whether it is in private credit or AI-related investments, etc. And that is why this is sort of an infinite doom loop. And the consequences are what you see in the bottom. And given that we haven't broken away from the habit that we started practicing way back from maybe the new millennium or even before that, of basically meeting every single structural problem with cyclical solutions like monetary easing, we are going to continue to face these structural cleavages or fault lines in the world. So the next 10 to 20 years, we should continue to see intensification of the forces or the consequences that are mentioned in the 5 pink boxes that you see at the bottom on a global basis. Now, this is the global context within which we are trying to become Viksit Bharat by 2047 or achieving self-reliance. Now, if you look at the record of 20th century, which countries became, or rather which countries moved from third world to first world? At the beginning of the century, of course, the most promising country in the world was Argentina in 20th century. But the record turned out to be very different, and East Asian countries, whether it is Hong Kong or whether it is Japan, followed by Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and to a limited extent, given its size, China later, were the ones that made the transition. Of course, you may include countries like Chile and some countries in Eastern Europe, etc. But they already had a very good start in terms of their per capita incomes. But really, from third world to first world, as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew put it in his autobiography, it was East Asia that did the transition. But East Asia did the transition in a very different geopolitical context. The United States helped several of them to rise because they saw them as a bulwark against the spread of communism. And I don't think that is necessarily the case today. And there was no energy transition constraint. Countries didn't have to choose between energy security, energy intensity, and energy transition. Demographics were different in several countries. Now it is changing for the worse. India probably has a good demographic window for about 10 to 15 years. And industrial policy in Northeast Asia, as many of you know, which well captured by Joe Studwell in his book, How Asia Works. Industrial policy in Northeast Asia focused on productivity and export performance in return for state protection. And state protection was not in perpetuity. These were the important features of why Northeast Asia was able to transition from third world to first world as compared to Southeast Asian nations. And then, of course, investment in primary education and the importance given to vocational skills, which will be very relevant in the world that is going to be dominated by AI if all the promises are going to be true with respect to AI. And these were some of the ingredients of why East Asia was able to transition to the first world. Now, all these conditions, at least the top 3 or 4, may be global in nature, but we have to make sure that we get some of the domestic policies correct with respect to the bottom 2 bullet points, and also with respect to industrial policy, where we have to make sure that whatever protection, subsidies, concessions, reliefs, trade insulation that we are able to give to domestic industry has to be in return for their contribution to national goals in terms of export performance, productivity, and so on. So in that sense, we do have a challenge on our hands, because we are trying to make this progress from where we are, lower middle income to upper income, in a very different and even hostile global setting than East Asia was able to do. So what is first let me get the good news. Obviously, one of the things that used to be a problem for us was overheating. Whether you look at the 80s, 90s, or even in the 2000s, after a few years of growth, our economy used to get into the problem of high inflation, high current account deficit, overvalued exchange rate, credit boom giving way to non-performing assets, etc. And I hope we have put that behind us. At least one reason why I'm somewhat hopeful that we have put it behind us is the fact that we have invested a lot on the supply side of the infrastructure, because that also imposed its own ceiling on sustainable growth. When aggregate demand grows faster, if supply was unable to meet it, it naturally resulted in higher inflation. And just one statistic, because we have covered all of this in the economic survey comprehensively, one statistic from this slide I want to draw your attention to is the fact that in the first 7 decades since independence, we built about 74 airports, and in the next 11 years, we more than doubled it to 159, not to mention many other parameters that I have mentioned here, and it is no need for me to repeat them all. They are in front of you. But I think the investments we have made in elevating the supply capability of the economy is standing us in good stead with respect to bringing down the average inflation rate in the economy, what it used to be in terms of 7% in the first 6 to 7 decades since independence, down to now 3 and 4% and converging with the developed world. Notwithstanding the cyclical vagaries of food prices, but I think on a trend basis, I think inflation is converging with developed world levels. And then with respect to the small and medium enterprises, which we all know are indispensable to the rise of manufacturing, and today's developed countries like Korea, Japan, Switzerland, Germany, or even UK and the US in their heydays when manufacturing was still very dominant in those countries, they did not make it to being industrialized without having nurtured and allowed their small and medium enterprises to grow. And one of the big constraints was access to finance and working capital. Now, financial institutions have done a lot of commendable work in the last 11 years, particularly State Bank, in improving access to finance for SMEs. But more importantly, innovations such as the receivables exchanges have also played their part, and that is where I think the corporate sector can still do a lot more. And the policy has given a nudge in the right direction by stipulating that a payment that is due to a small and medium enterprise is not allowed as a tax deduction except in the year when the payment is actually made. And that's an important nudge. But more than that, what you see in terms of structural innovation is to allow receivables exchanges to play their part when financial institutions or factors purchase the bills from the MSMEs and collect it from the corporate buyers on the due date, and if they don't pay up, it becomes an NPA. And that kind of discounting of bills, which is hardly 950 crores, in FY25 they reached a level of 2.33 lakh crores. And I think there is much more that can be done to improve the access to finance if large corporate and government buyers end up using the receivables exchanges platforms to accept their invoices and discount them on the platform. This year, this is a more recent government effort, but memories these days in the short-term memory cycles that we all have are very short. But 8 months ago, we had the direct tax reductions in the budget. That was significant because two-member income-earning family doesn't have to pay a single paise of tax this year for this year's income, as long as the income is below 26.75 lakh rupees, and that's a huge difference compared to the year before, and we tend to forget it. So there was a very significant boost given to disposable income in the budget in February 25, and now in September we have come up with this GST simplification, rationalization and rate reduction. Now many of you think about this too as government focusing on demand side of the economy, but both demand and supply sides are two sides of the same coin. A demand boost is what gives visibility to the corporate sector to boost its supply side investment, to boost the capital formation. And that is why I think despite the global uncertainties, early indications are suggesting that private sector capital formation is holding up well in 25-26 on top of an estimated good capital formation growth in 24-25 as well. So this is the good story, but as I said, as the theme of the conference also is making it clear, it is a fragmented world, and it is the one that is going to become even more challenging as to the Alberto Gallo side, which is what I pointed out earlier. And therefore, in that milieu, what are our challenges? I think in general, and I'm not sure that I'm capturing all the challenges of a country of 1.45 billion people, but what I see, and it is a subjective list, as important challenges for us in the next 25-30 years or maybe even longer: energy affordability, energy security, and energy transition. This is an important trade-off between them. Employment generation and artificial intelligence, we will spend some time on it. The share of income, a corollary of point number 2 is, if AI were to deliver the productivity gains, who benefits from it and how it is distributed? Both are ifs. First, AI has to deliver the productivity gains, which is still a work in progress at best. And if it does so, between capital and labor owners, who benefits? And all of us tend to focus on education and skilling in terms of reaping the rewards of demographic bulge sweet spot that we find ourselves in. But less talked about, but more important perhaps, are the mental, emotional and physical health of our youth cohort. And if we want our manufacturing share to rise, and we have to, and it is not just about rebalancing the economy between services, manufacturing and agriculture, but it is also about the goal of strategic indispensability that I mentioned earlier, that you cannot avoid having to improve manufacturing. And for that, we have to make sure that there is a good, viable middle stand in the Indian economy. And deregulation has a very big role to play in that, apart from many other things like access to finance, technology, and an ecosystem of innovation. And agricultural productivity, it is obviously India is now self-sufficient in food. So it's not about India alone. But if you look at demographic projections, in the next 25 years, the population in Africa, in the African continent, is going to double. And it will become more than 25 to 30% of the global population compared to what it is today. And therefore, if from a strategic perspective, investing in agricultural productivity and being able to export agricultural produce is going to be a useful strategic focus and objective for India, given the population trends that may be happening elsewhere in the world. And of course, if we get all these things right, then naturally we will be building strategic resilience and strategic indispensability in the world. And you can see that how strategic indispensability gave countries a lot of leverage over the tariff negotiations they have had with the United States in the last 10 months or so. Now, first of these list is the energy security versus energy transition trade-off. I may have mentioned this even last year when I spoke at the NCPA and the SBI Conclave. Those of you who were not present then, I would still recommend that you read The Material World by Ed Conway. And this particular Substack post from him on December 11, 2023 tells you what the energy per capita consumption gap between developing countries and the developed world today on the left side. On the right side, what you see, after net zero by 2050, this gap barely closes. So in other words, by imposing net zero and emission related constraints or obligations on the developing world, the developed world may end up keeping the energy gap between themselves and the developing world permanently high. This is equivalent to saying that the economic gap between the developed and the developing world will also remain wide. So because there is no country that is economically rich today which is energy poor in terms of consumption. Both go hand in hand. And if some of you do not remember the importance and significance of the date April 28th, I won't blame you. But I'll give you a few seconds to think about what April 28, 2025 means. It was the date of 9-hour energy blackout in Spain and parts of France and Portugal. That was not only because of the intermittency of solar and wind, but also because of their tendency to surge and then become a famine within a few seconds or a few minutes. And in India, we have other considerations because we collect a lot of taxes in selling petrol and diesel. And if you continue to increase the share of renewable energy, we have to precede that. We have to do, before that, increase the investment in upgrading our grids, which also requires more resources. And then there is dependence on outside nations for strategic minerals and rare earths that go into renewable energy generation. And then our railways derives 50% of its revenue from transporting coal from mines from pit heads to power generation plants. All these factors have to be taken into consideration when we pursue net zero and emission reduction as our overarching goals, because they do have a trade-off vis-a-vis energy security and energy affordability as well. We can't wish away the trade-off. More recently, there was a report that came out that in Germany, one of the contributing factors, apart from competition from a super competitive China, one of the factors that is contributing to deindustrialization is the rising energy cost, as is the case in Britain as well. And it is a function of the increasing share of renewable energy in their power generation mix. That is why in India, we have to adopt a menu of options and not just only solar and wind. That is why it is important that we are, as promised in the budget, that we open up nuclear energy to the private sector and amend the Civil Nuclear Liability Act, as was mentioned in the budget. And we invest in hydro energy and also in new technologies on carbon capture and storage, and also in battery storage, and also adapt energy demand management measures. Like, for example, investment in public transportation has to pay back in terms of increased usage, and for that there needs to be a last mile connectivity between public transportation and where the users live. Without that, India cannot afford to have the per capita vehicle ownership or vehicles on the road as developed countries have, simply because our numbers are too vast. So there has to be both a sense of urgency and understanding of this issue, because India has to approach energy transition both from a demand and supply perspective with respect to energy. And these are not my words, but these are words of Mr. Ed Conway explaining the previous slide, that the net zero focus of the developed countries risks consigning the developing world to a permanent low energy or therefore low development trap. And quite fortuitously, last week, Mr. Bill Gates, in his website, wrote a piece as a prelude to Belém COP30 summit, recognizing these trade-offs, which I spoke about in the last couple of minutes. And what he said is, and I won't read out the entire left side of this chart here, he simply says, sometimes the world acts as if any effort to fight climate change is as worthwhile as any other cause. As a result, less effective projects or diverting money and attention from efforts that will have more impact on the human condition, such as healthcare and agriculture, for example. In other words, it goes back to the fundamental lesson of Economics 101. Economics is all about trade-offs, and so is public policy. You cannot pursue corner solutions on energy transition without taking into consideration what it does to our per capita income and potential GDP growth as well. And on the right side, what you see is a report that I spoke about, which came out last week on the causes that are driving the deindustrialization today in Germany, and one of them is higher energy costs, which is in turn partly a consequence of the increased focus on adding more and more renewable energy, which requires more and more collateral investments as well. Now, the other big issue which is in everyone's mind, on top of their mind these days, is artificial intelligence, its deployment and what it means to the labor market. These are still early days, and that is why anecdotal stories, both positive and negative, dominate, because aggregate numbers are still scarce. And anecdotes have a very powerful dominance over statistics in people's minds, but they are not the most appropriate way to gauge their impact, which is still therefore evolving. One thing is, AI can have productivity gains for sure. AI can be very useful in taking education and healthcare to remotest corners of the country. It can even change the manner in which Indian pedagogy has evolved over the last 70 years in terms of rote learning. All these things are possible, but at the same time, it can also have implications for existing jobs. There is no doubt that it may create new jobs, but the question is, we have to get down to the next level. How many will be created? How many will be lost? What is the net number? And how many of those who are losing their jobs will be able to find alternative in this new AI-dominated world? What will be the incomes that they will be losing, and what kind of jobs will be created, whether they are high quality, high educational attainment, high income jobs, in which case the income inequality may widen. And over what time frame will the positive developments emerge compared to the adverse developments which may happen relatively sooner in terms of job displacement. So even if many of these positive developments happen, which they well might, they will take their own time to basically manifest themselves, and in the process therefore there is a lagged effect which are much more difficult to handle in democracies which are also fiscally constrained. So these are all the complexities of AI deployment. That is why how we handle the AI deployment is not just a matter of public policy, but also private responsibility. And if you look at this paper by a young AI researcher, Jason Hausenloy, in March 2025, it's a 10-page paper, I recommend you to read it. He talks about jobs that are have low vulnerability to AI. And he classifies those which are highly vulnerable, and it's a very useful framework or template to analyze. And that is what brings you back, or brings me back, to the emphasis on vocational skills and primary education and technical education as well. Jobs that will not be affected by AI, where the human content is necessary, are the ones that we need to focus on as well, apart from preparing our youth to be able to participate in the world of AI dominance. So in other words, manual skills, carpenting, painting, plumbing, electrical, geoengineering, all these things will have to be made fashionable, and not just wearing a trouser and shirt in a glass and steel building, writing codes. That is not going to be the industry or the job of the future. And therefore much work remains to be done, and it's going to be hard to change people's minds. It's very important to make vocational skills and vocational jobs fashionable. So that will require a lot of effort in terms of policy, and also in terms of private sector. Champions have to push the country in a direction where they are insulated from AI-related developments. And if it so turns out that the AI-related developments deliver net positive benefits, then we will still have diversified the economy and contributed to our overarching goal of boosting manufacturing as well, if we invest in technical and vocational education. The skill report of the CII V-Box, when it was first launched in 2014 for college graduates or those who have one more year to go, only 1/3 of the people who took the test passed the test. 2/3 were not found employable on the basis of this test. 11 years later, and we have put this chart in the economic survey before, 11 years later, the percentage has gone up by about 18 percentage points. Now it is basically little over 1 in 2 pass the test. That also means just under 1 in 2 are still not employable. So the skill development aspect still remains a work in progress. And once again, India's numbers make this challenge an important and an urgent one. There are multiple initiatives, particularly in the last 2 budgets, whether it is internship program or the importance given to polytechnic or ITIs and vocational skills, and the centers of AI excellence. So there is no dearth of efforts, but as always, it requires 2 sides to clap, 2 hands to clap. But the private sector and academia also have to basically come together in being able to incentivize and facilitate both behaviorally and monetarily skilling upgrades on the part of the youth cohort as well. Now, the third dimension with respect to manufacturing and the growth of small and medium enterprises. The empirical evidence is very compelling. The more we move towards economic freedom, the greater is the GDP per capita. There is a very strong positive correlation across nations. And that is the direction in which we are setting out to go, especially so this year, with multiple initiatives on the part of the government. Whether it is the high-level committee headed by the former Cabinet Secretary, Mr. Rajiv Gauba, the 2 informal groups of ministers looking at non-financial sector-related deregulation, or the task force under the Cabinet Secretary which looks at state government deregulation efforts. They are very important because ultimately we have to remove the important pain points that Indian entrepreneurs have expressed in a World Bank survey. Senior management times spent dealing with regulation, or firms identifying tax administration, firms expected to give gifts to get operating license. These are all public information from World Bank surveys. Especially these numbers would be much higher in the case of small and medium enterprises, because given that they have limited human resources, the amount of time they spend, the management bandwidth that goes towards compliance, inspection and licensing is better spent on marketing and production processes. And that is why deregulation matters in removing the fear of growth and enabling growth in small, micro and medium enterprises. Not so much for large enterprises, because without them, there is no innovation cluster that will happen, and there is no global supply chain that will happen, because they are the ones that feed components and technology and innovation towards large enterprises. So deregulation is critical for the rise of manufacturing and the rise of SMEs' role in manufacturing. I spoke about state-level deregulation. These are newspaper headlines over the last 8 to 9 months, and there is much more, and we will be covering this in the economic survey. This is a good news story. The various states have addressed many of the regulatory compliances and compulsions and prohibitions that were imposed on enterprises. And we are just giving you a sample of them in this slide, and it is an exercise that is continuing as well. So having done the first phase, we will be looking at moving to the second phase of deregulation as well, and it is I'm very gratified to share with you that there is a lot of appetite in states to continue with the deregulation efforts as well. And more recently, apart from the headlines that I shared with you in the previous slide, Andhra Pradesh has come up with the most important area, which is a very difficult area from political economy perspective, which is about ease of land use conversion. They have almost made it automatic. And Uttar Pradesh amending the building bylaws is also an equally comprehensive effort, and several states have eased their mining regulations, which collectively add up to something very significant as well. So there is a lot of positive momentum on deregulation, which unfortunately, you may not be able to measure on a one-to-one basis in terms of impact on growth, because growth is eventually subject to multiple other developments outside our control as well. That is why counterfactual is so hard in economics. But over time, these will definitely boost the potential growth and the actual growth performance of the Indian economy. Now, going back, this is the area where I think we need to spend some more time in terms of an effort, not today in this discussion, but I'm saying in general, because ultimately, in the way the world is going to evolve with greater military conflicts, trade conflicts, financial repression, populism, etc., each country has to be not only taking care of its needs, but also in being able to do so, you need to have certain leverage as well. I'm just sharing one example, which is that is why we need to move away from just focusing on import substitution, whether it is done intelligently or not. And it should mean investment in national strength. This evolves in 3 stages. Import substitution, build domestic capacity, but that phase we tried between 1950 and 1980, it did not result in efficiency gains or productivity gains, it only basically led to pampering. But therefore, we have to now focus on strategic resilience, withstand external shocks through redundancy and diversification. And the next step is strategic indispensability, make India globally replaceable in key value chains, which we are not at the moment. In other words, the focus should shift from can we make it at home to can we keep functioning if the world breaks down, and in the next step, can the world function without us? We have to be basically moving from the first question to the second and second question to the third. Without that, this building national resilience in a fragmented world will remain conference theme, but not progress beyond that. And this is one example. And I think we are taking action in this area, whether in terms of the various processes in semiconductor chip production. India doesn't figure anywhere in this list. That is why the semiconductor mission is critically important. We have to get our foot inside the door to be able to sit at the table in the first place. And semiconductor mission is about getting our foot inside the room. Same thing applies to the AI mission or what we are doing with the superfast train between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. In all these areas, it will create a technological ecosystem which will then create benefits in allied areas as well and build up the pool of technological manpower and also knowledge base as well. So in other words, we have to emulate that from a few areas to several areas, whether it is in pharmaceutical or agriculture or industry or even in services. We have to be part of the evolving global technologically sophisticated ecosystem. And that is why we have the advantage of 28 states. Some who are already middle income capable can do these high-tech areas and innovation. Some who are still lower down in the economic development ladder can concentrate on labor-intensive manufacturing before they move up the value chain. So we have the geographical spread to be able to span labor-intensive manufacturing to high-tech manufacturing. And that is where I think the real constraint is not policy or not resources, but also the mindset. This extract, and these are all not my words, from a particular Substack post of 24th June was written in the context of the United States, but you simply have to replace the word America with India, and these messages still will resonate very, very well. In a democracy, there is a natural tendency towards short-term goals and short-term gratification. And that is why, and even in a country which has an evolved capital markets as we have, with quarterly earnings reports and so on, there is a natural tendency to be able to cater to the market's demands, which in today's world is probably going to be somewhat counterproductive because you require long-term goals that transcend quarterly earnings per share measurement. And that is why those societies which we thought had erred in not putting their capital markets development ahead of national imperatives now seem to be having their upper hand vis-a-vis us. So we may have therefore developed ourselves financially far better or far ahead of time than we needed to. And in a world that is going to be increasingly fractious and fragmented, where strategic resilience is an imperative, where globalization is not going to come to our aid, and small components can be useful tools of strategic leverage, we have to ask ourselves whether the compulsions of markets and democracy will really enable us to transcend those barriers and be able to achieve goals of national interest. And this is a question that is not just relevant for the public sector, but also for private sector, banking, non-banking, and non-financial as well. Concluding thoughts. As I said, we are a country that have defied odds. I mean, I was with my team in Cochin shipyard last weekend, and I'm going to share some slides there with you. There is a lot that is happening beneath the headlines in a positive way. Whether it is the amount of efforts we have taken in the last 1 year on critical minerals capability building, on semiconductor mission, on manufacturing, etc., we are getting a lot of things right as well. But again, given our size and given the demographic bulge we have, we need to do a lot more. But the good news is, this is a problem that is faced by many others, and at least we are having the growth rate that will give us the resources to be able to sustain these initiatives. And for this financial year, many players are revising their growth rates upward, which looked unthinkable 2 months ago, and that's a good sign. And over the next several years, the IMF's World Economic Outlook projects Indian GDP to grow towards 6.6 trillion and an exchange rate that will be steady and stable rather than continuously depreciating. These are very good projections. These symbolize a certain sense of confidence about India's trajectory, and it is up to us to deliver on them. This is what I refer to in terms of what I saw in Cochin shipyard. They have built a new dry dock, and the amount of technological sophistication that has gone into it is something that should make all of us proud and happy and optimistic about the future. The amount of steel used, 70,000 metric tons, is 10 times the quantity of steel used in Eiffel Tower. You could build 10 Eiffel Tower with the amount of steel used. 7.2 lakh tons of concrete, which is 1.25 times used in the Bandra-Worli Sea Link, can hold 242 million liters of water, equivalent to 100 numbers of Olympic-sized swimming pools. 5,000 number of RCC piles, 26 times the number of piles installed in Burj Khalifa in Dubai. 5.5 lakh cubic meters of excavated material disposed to sea, equivalent to relaying 300 numbers of football fields. Electrical cables running to 80 kilometers and service pipelines runs to 20 kilometers. And the water will be treated before it is let back into the sea, because once a ship is built, it has to be floated into the water and the dry dock becomes flooded with water. And then once the ship sails out for testing, then the water has to be let back into the sea, and that is fully, efficiently, chemically treated before it is let back into the sea. So, a lot of these wonderful developments are happening as well. We just have to make them from anecdotes into national statistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nageswaran, for that. Now I please invite on stage Sri Rana Ashutosh Kumar Singh, MD, RC and SARG at State Bank of India for a Q&A session with the CEA.
First of all, thank you very much. Gratitude, sir. You could join us in person this time. So, and thank you so much, sir. And very engaging and very comprehensive presentation. We still have 8 minutes left, so we can squeeze some questions, sir. A couple of questions I have, though I have a list of questions pre-printed kind of, but I'm not going to use that. The presentation itself is so comprehensive, there is no time for that also. Maybe a couple of questions from the audience. But first, my question, sir. So in your presentation, we saw a lot of important points there on the employability, that is one. The education and a skill. And interestingly, the previous panel, which was economist panel, there are a lot of discussion happening on those themes. education, skilling, separate education versus a skill, education with a skill. Another important point I saw in your presentation, sir, the Germany. You talked about Germany in terms of the energy issue they are facing. Also, the way forward for the country, import substitution. And third point was there that how we make ourselves strategically indispensable kind of for the world. So Germany model is, if one has to identify the biggest contributor to their success of the economy. Now they are struggling for a different reason, that is a different thing. But the middle stand, the SMEs. And SME success was their education system, the vocational training system, where you have education and a skill going together. And I saw a slide on that also, what we are doing towards skilling our population and so we have engineers, but they are not employable. That is a challenge we are facing. So any learning we have, or we are trying to learn something from the German system, making our youth more employable, and maybe making our SMEs going forward, the world champions, the global champions. Any thought on that, sir?
No, I think that is the emphasis that the government in the last 2 budgets has put in terms of incentivizing internships, revamping the ITIs, and further amending the Apprenticeship Act, etc., and also creating the centers of excellence in artificial intelligence, etc. All these are all multiple different initiatives that try to bring the importance of vocational education back into the national mainstream. And I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight the success of Odisha under Mr. Subrato Bagchi over the 7 years period from 2016 to 2023, when he was the chairperson of the Odisha Skill Development Authority. What he did to make physical and occupational skills fashionable, respectable, and aspirational is a model that other states can emulate, and I'm glad to tell you that many states are indeed trying to emulate that model. So these are the ways in which we can replicate some of their early successes in other countries on manufacturing and in creating that Mittelstand.
Thank you, sir. Sir, another question. So the lot of economics we talked in the previous panel, and so I'm digressing a little bit, and something I saw in your presentation also. So I'm taking this liberty to digress a bit. I was listening to one of your recent podcasts, and where again I noticed a very interesting comment you made, and which is kind of not in sync with what is happening as of now. So I'll tell you what it is. What you said in this podcast was that financial system, the regulations should be principle based. Something like that you mentioned. I know that we as a country, we have started, RBI has started, particularly RBI have talked about the banking regulator. 2014, 2015, that was the time RBI started moving away from rule-based supervision to principle-based supervision. And 2025, CA saying that financial sector side, we should be more on the principle, and there was a very good argument about that. We should be more on the principle-based regulation. Prescriptive, yeah, so that is essentially.
I'll come to that.
So essentially you are saying that prescriptive, so rule-based supervision. So it is kind of a different approach from what RBI is trying to do as of now, as the banking regulator. So what is the thought behind that, sir?
Yeah, so I wrote this book in 2019 called The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences and Cure. And even in my remarks today, I did leave the thought on the table whether the financialization of the Indian economy in some parts has it run ahead of national imperatives or the national economic development. When financial growth happens faster than national economic growth, empirical evidence across the world tells us that countries face important challenges in either attracting talent in non-financial sectors. And the reason why I said between principle-based and prescriptive rules and regulations, the relative emphasis should be principle-based for non-financial sector and slightly more leaning towards prescriptive rules when it comes to finance, Because in non-financial sectors, competition plays the role of the regulator. In financial sector, competition can actually accentuate the risks and the imbalances, making the system more unstable. So therefore, and secondly, when the financial system therefore gets into a crisis because of excess risk taking, then the spillover effect on the rest of the economy is substantial, and the need for a public sector bailout is inevitable. And therefore, in these situations, the public sector therefore has a moral obligation to ensure, because it is public resources that are then used for bringing the sector back to health, then naturally it has a right also to impose the kind of regulation that will prevent such an occurrence from happening. So precisely because of the distinction of the role that competition plays between non-financial and financial sectors, I made the case for a relative overweight in terms of prescriptive rules in the financial sector and principle-based rules in the non-financial sectors.
No, good point, sir, and particularly my personal view again, this is not the MD SBI view. My personal view is the maturity level in the financial ecosystem in the country. It's at different levels. So maybe one segment of the REs, the regulated entities, they are mature enough maybe for a principal-based supervision, but there will be another segment where we still need some more time at least, a rule-based supervision. So with this, sir, if you permit, maybe a couple of questions from the audience, sir. So the floor is open. Any questions?
I think people are waiting for the national anthem.
No, I think I can see one person at least, sir. Yes, please. Sampath, go ahead.
Good evening,
please.
sir. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Now, the question which comes again and again is that how are we going to tackle the disparity between, the haves and have-nots? Has it come down, or what are the long-term strategies? How do we ensure employment to every youth who is in the country? When do we achieve that dream? More than achieving that trillions of dollars of dream, getting a good employment for our youth becomes very important.
So, first of all, I think in the limited time we have, it will be difficult to give you a comprehensive answer to an important question that you have posed. Inequality is also a function of how you measure it, whether it is in terms of consumption or income or wealth. In terms of consumption, then you have to take into account not only the resources or the disposable income that they have, and also how far it is supplemented by transfers from the states. On that basis, India's inequality is actually quite low. And in terms of income as well, if you really take into account on a post-tax and post-transfers from the state, or which means the governments, again, the so-called Gini coefficient on a pre-tax, pre-transfer basis, that comes down quite significantly on a post-transfer basis. And we have written about it in the economic survey, or also in a small compendium of special essays we brought out towards the end of 2023. This is a never-ending topic, and I think the way to look at this topic is, while all of us sort of wave our hands at inequality, because it kind of strikes at the notion of intrinsic concept of fairness which all human beings subscribe to. It's important from the perspective of public policy to continuously look at expanding the opportunity set available to people. And humans in general are far more concerned with absolute improvements in their status rather than in relative comparisons, which comes next. And therefore, the state's obligation is to make sure that every generation feels that compared to the previous generation that they have had it better, and that the succeeding generations will do better than them. As long as the public policies are able to continuously deliver on this, then inequality per se becomes a relatively secondary consideration. But as I said, this is a short time. I've given you a brief answer, but we have covered it extensively in the economic survey and in the special essay compendium in 2023. Please take a look at this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So one more question, if we, otherwise we'll close. So
One hand there at the bottom.
I can't see anybody. Okay, please.
Thank you, sir. In the economics survey before the July 2024 budget, it had mentions of China +1 strategy for India. I think it's echoing. Sir, the question is on the China +1 strategy. It had mentions in the economic survey 2024. With the tariffs playing into picture, how is India positioning, currently?
So obviously, in terms of the components of imports that India takes from China, which consist largely of intermediate goods and capital goods, there is a certain dependency, because if it is finished goods, then it is easier to replace them. Capital goods and intermediate goods have a different role to play in our production process. And the way to look at it as to how to reduce our dependence, one way is to look at investment as an option, which is what the survey wrote about 1 year ago. And that is why I think it's important to first, at the first stage, focus on foreign companies located in China and exporting to India. Whether it is in chemicals or infrastructure equipment or electronics, there is much scope for trying to incentivize the relocation, as we have done in the case of Apple, and there the domestic value addition is improving by the day in India. In other areas as well, we need to find ways to incentivize and invite non-Chinese companies operating in China, exporting not only to India but also the rest of the world, and make them manufacture here, which makes us therefore less dependent on imports from China, and also gives us a gateway into becoming an important player in the global value chain.
Sure, sir. Thank you.
We'll close, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nageswaran. I would now request Chairman SBI to please come on the stage and present Dr. Nageswaran with a green certificate.